Hi, Inside the Vatican listeners, it's Colleen. After we recorded this week's show, news broke that Pope Leo had summoned the heads of the world's bishops' conferences to the Vatican in October for a meeting on family life. This is inspired by the 10th anniversary of Amoris Laetitia, which was Pope Francis's major document on the family. We don't know a lot yet about this meeting, but you can read some early reporting and analysis at americamagazine.org and linked in our show notes. And of course, we'll cover the story in much further depth on Inside the Vatican. Now to our regular show. Welcome back to Inside the Vatican with America Media. I'm your host, Colleen Dulle, and as always, I am joined by our veteran Vatican correspondent, Gerard O'Connell. Gerry, I am calling you from Connecticut today, where I'm giving a lecture at a university here. So good morning from Connecticut.
Good afternoon from sunny Rome, Colleen. I wish you well at the lecture. I hope they appreciate what you have to say. And I look forward to being in New York next week with Elisabetta.
Yes, to present your book at Fordham. We're really excited to have you, and our listeners will get to hear a special episode that you and me and Elisabetta and Ashley McKinless from our Jesuitical podcast are recording together next week. So that'll be in the place of a regular episode. But for this week, we're going to talk first in the beginning of the show about the latest on Pope Leo's efforts to make peace and push for an end to the war in Iran. And we're going to analyze how he's using a variety of different venues to make that push. And in the second part of our show, we're going to look at a few brief stories, including Pope Leo's move into the Apostolic Palace this past weekend, his meeting with an investigative journalist about Opus Dei, a recent development in the Vatican's trial of the century, and the Pope's planned address to Americans on July 3rd. But Gerry, our focus at the beginning of this week is how Pope Leo is using nearly every meeting and tool he has to push for peace in the world. So I want to start by giving an overview. Let's start with the talk that he gave on Friday, March 13th, that got a lot of attention. This was when Pope Leo was speaking to a group of priests and seminarians about the sacrament of reconciliation. And in this talk, he said, "One might ask, do those Christians who bear grave responsibility in armed conflicts have the humility and courage to undertake a serious examination of conscience and go to confession?" There's been a lot of talk about who this could be referring to, so I wanted to throw that question to you, Gerry.
Yes, there was also much speculation here as to whom he was referring. Well, obviously, it's not to those in Iran because they're Muslims.
Mm. And he says Christians who bear grave responsibility.
Christians, yeah. It's obviously not to Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's leading this war. So the only Christians who are heavily involved in the war are in the American administration. But as I said, the Pope has made this statement. It's not clear who it's being directed to, but given the context, given what's actually happening, this is being read that it's known that there are a number of Catholics in the administration and a number of people who describe themselves as Christians in the top levels of the administration who are involved in conducting this war. So people put 2 and 2 together and maybe got 5, but they certainly got 4.
Yeah, I mean, he did also say, he said Christians who bear grave responsibility in armed conflicts, and that could also be referring to other wars, right? That could, for example, refer to the war in Ukraine, which has Christians at the leadership of Russia.
Absolutely. And if you think back that Pope Francis called out the Patriarch of Moscow for effectively blessing the what they call the military operation, special military operation. That's what they call the war. Putin calls the war in Ukraine. The reality is that, as he has done in previous times, Leo is calling people to awaken their conscience and to take moral responsibility for what they are doing, and to take moral responsibility before God for what they're doing and before humanity. And I think this is the bottom line that he's getting across. Of course, if you say he's pointing at one person or another, people will respond immediately, well, he didn't name anybody. Well, he hasn't named Israel or he hasn't named the United States in this war. He's mentioned Iran a number of times. And that's kind of a diplomatic way of approaching the question.
Right. It's, as we've talked about previously on the show, standard Vatican practice for a pope not to name aggressors, at least very rare for them to name aggressors when they're making these public talks. Now, this speech to the priests and seminarians, this comment about them, about leaders going to confession was a little bit indirect. He says, one might ask, do these people have the courage to undertake an examination of conscience? But on Sunday, we saw Pope Leo give a very direct appeal to world leaders. He called for a ceasefire in what a lot of news outlets are saying was his strongest appeal yet for peace because he directly addressed those responsible. He said, I appeal to those responsible for this conflict, cease fire so that avenues for dialogue may be reopened. Gerry, I was wondering what you made of these comments. Did you think they were his strongest yet?
So each of the 3 Sundays since the war has started, Sunday the 1st of March, the 8th of March, and now the 15th of March, he has, in one way or another, called for a halt, a stop to the fighting, and for finding space for negotiation, as he said this past Sunday. He's also, last Sunday, he was very explicit. He said, I call on those responsible for the conflict. And those responsible for the conflict are the leaders of the 3 countries, United States, Israel, and Iran. And he said, I call on those responsible, cease fire. In other words, stop the fighting. Then he encouraged them to find space to negotiate. Well, many people around the world are calling for that now. Political leaders, the Secretary General of the United Nations, the head of the World Health Organization, many people, religious leaders, but nobody's listening yet. And I've also heard that from people who've spoken with Leo that he is firmly against this war.
That's not a surprise to anyone who's been listening to him lately. On Sunday, he also made a reference to the bombing of schools, which a lot of people took as a reference to the attack on the girls' school that killed 170 people, most of them students, that a preliminary investigation has found the U.S. responsible for. And I wanted to point that out because the Osservatore Romano, the Vatican's newspaper, got a lot of attention a couple of weeks ago for publishing a photo of the graves being dug for those students as its front page photo with the caption, The Face of War. And that went viral online. So, Gerry, following along with what Pope Leo has been doing and saying, in addition to this first indirect appeal to the consciences of leaders to say you should confess, and then this second one appealing directly to them for a ceasefire, on Monday, Leo spoke to journalists from the Italian television broadcaster Rai, and he talked to them about how to cover wars. And he said to do it through the eyes of the victims. And he urged them to guard against the risk of turning into propaganda. He said the task of journalists in verifying the news so as not to become a megaphone for power becomes even more urgent and delicate and indeed essential, speaking about these times of war. And Gerry, as a reporter and someone who's married to a war correspondent, I was wondering how these comments landed for you.
Well, I think it's very true. I mean, I hear Elisabetta saying it's she agrees absolutely with the Pope. It is up to you, and she said it's up to us journalists to show the suffering that the war always brings to people, to show the face of war and tell it through the eyes of the victim so as not to turn it into a video game.
Again, this video game language that we talked about last week with Cardinal Supich's appeal about the gamification of war.
Absolutely. And it is interesting that Leo actually used those words, turning the war into a video game, because that's what came out of the White House. And Cardinal Supich challenged that.
You're referring to those, what they called the hype videos, right? Where they were putting together video games, sports sequences, action movies with footage from the war.
Exactly. And this was seen as really dehumanizing. And Leo is saying that journalists have a responsibility First of all, to verify the information, not to put information and be instruments of those in power. If you think back, and those are the listeners who may remember back to the 2003 war in Iraq, against Iraq, how the media also played a role in conveying that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, when history proved, and also people at the time were saying, it was not true. And so it is well known that one of the first victims of war is truth. And so the Pope is saying the journalists have a responsibility to verify the news.
Gerry, also on Monday, we saw the Pope using maybe more traditional diplomatic channels. He had a call with the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas. The Vatican, as expected, said very little about what was actually discussed, but I wanted to ask you what we know about that call.
Well, we know that Abbas, who is now quite old, he phoned the Pope. He wanted to bring to his attention the situation of the Palestinian people, both in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. Now you have 2.2 million people in Gaza, Palestinians, many of them living in tents in weather which recently it's rained and you've had sandstorms, and you have the humanitarian aid is being really restricted. Though the the ceasefire accord was meant to open up the doors for the flow of humanitarian aid, this is not happening. And then in the West Bank, you've had, since the 7th of October 2023, since that attack on Israel by Hamas, you've had 1,000 people killed. You have settlers attacking the Palestinians in their own land, and many of them are now living in fear. I've spoken to people who've been there recently. The checkpoints, the difficulty of getting in, it is really terrible. And they feel that, as one person told me yesterday, they feel that ethnic cleansing is underway. And Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, said that he described the situation to the Pope.
And we know that this is something that the Holy See has been following closely. I remember back in the fall, I believe, we talked about this Vatican editorial that came out that warned against the planned annexations of further areas of the West Bank. And the Holy See was really concerned about this.
Yeah, well, the Holy See recognizes, as do 130 or 40 countries in the world, they recognize the state of Palestine.
Right. They have diplomatic relations with them.
Yes. And the Vatican said the Pope spoke about the need to respect international law and human dignity. International law would protect these people. But in the present context, Israel is not showing great respect for international law. In fact, little respect. And human dignity, well, we see what the situation is in Gaza. But the reality, why did the Palestinian leader phone the Pope? Because in this present conflict in the war in Iran, and also to an extent the war now in Lebanon, has completely eclipsed what is happening to the Palestinians. They were at the start of the war and everybody was focusing on the Palestinians. Today, who is talking about the Palestinians? And this was the reason. And I think the Vatican made the call known publicly immediately afterwards. And that too is a signal,
A signal to say we're still paying attention to this.
Yes, and this is a conflict. This is a situation that cannot be overlooked.
So, Gerry, when we look at these stories that we've just run through together, we see Leo making a few pointed appeals, right? He appeals to leaders to stop the fighting in the Angelus Address, and this is an appeal that he made on behalf of Christians of the Middle East and all women and men of goodwill. Then he appeals to Christian leaders indirectly to go to confession, which is an appeal to their conscience in that talk to the priests and seminarians. He appeals to journalists to raise up the stories of victims and to guard against propaganda. What do those tell you together about Leo's approach to ending the war?
Well, remember from the day one, Leo spoke about peace. His mottos are peace and unity. And unity in a world which is so polarized is a kind of almost a dream right now. It's a hope, but it's not a reality. What it says is that Leo is deeply concerned, as I said earlier, I know from people, he's deeply concerned about these ongoing wars. And he expressed very clearly 4 Sundays ago his feeling about what was happening in Ukraine. In these past 3 Sundays, he's focused more on Iran and now Lebanon. And he also meets people from he meets church leaders from the Middle East. He meets political leaders from different countries. So it is part and parcel of his pontificate since he was elected on May the 8th. And he is trying to see what he can do. But he's also expecting, and I've said this before on the program, he's also expecting the bishops' conferences in the different countries where possible, and this is particularly the case with the United States more than in Iran or in the Holy Land. He expects them to speak out, to be proactive, to work for peace, to try to reduce the conflict, to try and push for negotiations to end the conflict. And some are responding, some bishops, some cardinals, but he would like to see the bishops' conference really being more proactive. They've made one statement, the president of the conference made a statement, but that's still far from, I think, what Leo would like to happen.
Mhm. Gerry, we've talked about the public statements, but what else do we know about the Vatican's behind the scenes work for peace in this conflict?
We know that they're constantly in contact with the patriarch of the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem,
That would be Cardinal Pizzaballa.
Cardinal Pizzaballa, yes. We know that the Pope has met the Cardinal from Tehran, Matthew,
This was the one who was evacuated from Iran.
but he also hears from other religious leaders, and he hears from the United Nations. From the amount of information coming into the Vatican is really substantial, and so it is not that they don't know what's happening. And they even know of the divisions in the different countries between different peoples. And remember, the Vatican has always had diplomatic relations with Iran and with Israel. And so there's a limit to what they can do, but he has a pulpit, and people listen, and people wait to see what he's going to say. And but his appeal to the consciences of those responsible for the war. I think we'll hear more and more of that.
All right, Gerry, we're going to leave the story here for this week, but you can read about all these various statements of the Pope, as well as the Pope's call with Mahmoud Abbas, all at americamagazine.org. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll cover more news from the Vatican this week. Stay with us. Welcome back. On Monday, news broke that Pope Leo will be receiving the Liberty Medal from the National Constitution Center in the United States. This is a prestigious award that's gone to prominent Americans like John Lewis and John McCain, as well as international figures like the Dalai Lama and Malala Yousafzai. The Pope, they said, will deliver his acceptance remarks via live stream from the Vatican to a live ceremony in Philadelphia, where the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were signed on July 3rd, which is the eve of the nation's 250th anniversary. But Jerry, a lot has been made of the fact that Leo turned down an invitation to visit the US for its 250th anniversary, which we've said before is standard Vatican practice in an election year. So, what do this award and the Pope's decision to accept it tell you about Leo's relationship with the US?
Well, he is, after all, an American citizen. He obviously appreciates the anniversary. He is one of the beneficiaries of what happened in the United States. He was born there. This offered him an opportunity to be present in one way or another at this historic moment in the history of the nation. And he accepted it. And so there's a lot of interest in seeing what he will say, because he surely has a lot to say that 250 years after, the country is at war. 250 years after, the country is deeply polarized. 250 years afterwards, the first American is on the Sea of Peter. And 250 years afterwards, America is clashing with much of the world. So he will have a lot to say. And I think I would obviously one of the elements you can imagine would be the call for peace and the fighting. But he will also be concerned, I think, about the divisions within the country, the polarization, and the treatment of migrants. Remember, he's a descendant of migrants, like Pope Francis, who was descendant of Italian migrants. He's a descendant of migrants too. And so I would be really astounded if he does not touch on the question of migration and the treatment of migrants and the respect for human dignity. It's pluralistic. It's people of different races, colors, nationalities, religions. And he will want that the hallmark of the nation should be respect for each person with their particular contribution to the life of the country. And I think it will be very interesting to see what he says, and that he has chose to accept it. And on the eve of the anniversary, I think tells a lot that, his message is, I too am an American. I too have something to say to my country and my fellow citizens.
Yeah, and it kind of flies in the face of some of the narratives that we saw about him rebuffing the invitation to the 250th and his decision to spend July 4th in Lampedusa with migrants in this Italian island. So I think that this adds some nuance to maybe that conversation. And also, we'll get to see what exactly he has to say to the US in this anniversary. Next up, the Vatican confirmed on Saturday, March 14th, that Pope Leo had finally moved into the Apostolic Palace. This comes after a lot of different reports claiming previously that he had already moved in, but finally it's been clarified. And Jerry, my question for you is what took so long?
Well, the apartment had not been inhabited for more than 12 years since Benedict resigned on the he left the apartment on the 28th of February 2013. And since then, nobody has lived in it.
Right, because Pope Francis, we should say, lived in the Santa Marta guest house where he lived during the conclave and he chose to stay there.
Yes, Francis never wanted to live there. He felt he was cut off from people. Remember, this also is a very ancient building. It's 400 more years. And so it required constant upkeep, and why it didn't happen, that's another question. And then he's not exactly going into the place exactly as John Paul II left it. he's moving into, as you've also found out, a kind of a higher level.
Quite literally a higher level, like, it's been called an attic in some reports. He's at least one level up from the traditional papal apartment, and had a suite made for him out of former staff and guest quarters. And some reports are saying this will have a gym in it, maybe a cooking area, but at least what we know for sure is that he's not living in the usual papal apartment. He's living in this one that has been created, which might also be a little simpler. It may be a marriage of the kind of Francis and other previous other pope styles.
Yes, and he will be in that place with uh, his two secretaries. There was a lot of rumor that he was going to move in with.
A community of Augustinians, right?
No, no, he's following the practice. He has his secretaries living. Francis had them on the same floor as him, whereas he in Santa Marta. Benedict had his secretary living with him, and so they're the only ones that will be up there. I don't know if there will be any people cooking for him or sisters.
He did hire a Peruvian chef, like, very early after the election, I remember.
Yes, but we don't know the details, and interestingly, they gave no photos of where he was
They
going.
gave no photos, and I read, and I haven't been able to check this out independently yet, but that, he's going to have a little terrace with an in like, his apartment's facing an internal courtyard, so it's not gonna be a place that you can photograph like they did with John Paul II, in his last days. "Oh, is the Pope's light on? Is it off?" in his bedroom.
But obviously, people will visit him, and news will get out. I remember in the meetings before the conclave, the cardinals, many of them wanted him, especially the older ones, wanted him to go back to where
To
it
the
was. And
Apostolic Palace,
yeah,
yeah. And that's for a variety of reasons. There's the messaging about tradition, but there's also, just some practical cost and security concerns. They had to make Santa Marta kind of fit for a pope.
yeah. Well, tradition is it's a limited tradition because the popes have lived in various places in the city and also not in Rome.
Mhm, that's right.
Or in Avignon. So it's people. Some people are happy, others are preferred that the more accessible pope.
Mhm.
Because to get up to him in that place, will have to. Uh, very few people will be able to walk in as they were in Santa Marta.
Yeah, that's right. Sherry, continuing on, yesterday on March 17th, the news broke that the Vatican's appeal court was going to re examine part of its trial of the century. This is the trial that implicated Cardinal Becciu. It was regarding the London finance scandal, where the Vatican lost a lot of money on a property deal in London. Can you just explain what we know?
Well, there are two things. First of all, you had the first instance trial, which gave its verdict last year, and which condemned Cardinal Becciu to some years in prison and some of the other, and acquitted a few.
Co defendants, right?
Yeah. Now, at that first trial, the objections that were presented by the lawyers for the defendants at this trial were the same. They were saying the prosecution did not respect the rules, the judicial system, because it did not make available to the lawyers of the defendants and the defendants all the information that they had and on which they were basing the prosecution.
Mhm. This led to a lot of questions being debated publicly over whether you can really get a fair trial in the Vatican.
Yes. Well, what happened was that they did not, in fact, make everything available. They omitted some things, like conversations, etc. And the second charge of the defendants, of lawyers, was that the Pope Francis had issued 4 rescripts that gave special powers to the prosecution. Now, 3 of those were ordinary scripts, but the appeals court said that the fourth one was effectively a new piece of legislation where it gave extra powers to the prosecutor to actually investigate, including phone tapping, etc., which was not in the original legislation. And they said that legislation, that was a piece of legislation, and therefore it should have been publicly published in the way legislation is normally done. So the lawyers for the prosecution had put these two issues. First of all, the prosecutors did not give all the information. Two, Francis had effectively interfered with the judicial process. They put these two objections to the first instance of the court, the first instance of the trial, and they pushed very hard, and the court of first instance rejected them. The Court of Appeal accepted them, and they said they didn't ask to go back to square one and start everything, so it's not a total mistrial, but they said aspects of it have to be readdressed and represented. And they have said they have given the prosecution until the 15th of June to make all the information available to the defendants' lawyers and the defendants. And they said, and then on the 22nd of June, the new stage of the trial will continue in the appeals court.
So, Gerry, is this essentially a retrial?
No. This is what's important. It is a part of the original trial being redone. But they said that the verdict of the first tribunal still stands.
Interesting.
Those who were acquitted in the first instance remain acquitted. Those who are convicted remain still convicted. When the lawyers for the defendants have all the information, they will then have to see if some of that information effectively changes the whole case.
Got it.
If anybody is confused listening to my presentation, but believe me, it is a very complicated decision by the appeals court yesterday.
So, Gerry, I have so many more questions about this really complicated decision, but we will explain that further to our listeners as we learn more and also as the trial continues. But for this week, we'll move on. And our final story this week is that Pope Leo met with the journalist Gareth Gore on Monday. Gore is the author of Opus, which is a more than 450-page expose on the Catholic organization Opus Dei. Now, Opus Dei refutes a lot of the claims that he makes in the book. They released their own more than 100-page rebuttal of it. And this meeting comes after Leo met twice with Opus Dei's leader, and it also comes in the middle of a long-running process for Opus Dei to restructure its rules to meet certain requirements set up by Pope Francis. I interviewed Gareth Gore after this meeting, and he said that he asked the Pope to pause that reform process in order to carry out an independent investigation into various abuses alleged against Opus Dei, including spiritual and sexual abuse and labor trafficking. There's a lot more in that interview, so I will link to that in our show notes, and you can find it at americamagazine.org. Gerry, that does it for this week. I'm excited to see you in New York next week with Elisabetta and to present your book.
Yes, we're looking forward very much to that and to visiting America. And it's a long time. I haven't been in New York, Colleen, since the presentation of my book on the election.
Your last conclave book.
Absolutely.
That's right. 2019.
April 2019, yes.
A whole different world, Gerry. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing you then. Inside the Vatican is a production of America Media. This week's episode was produced and edited by Kevin Christopher Robles. To keep up with the latest news out of the Vatican, subscribe to America Magazine at americamagazine.org/subscribe. For America Media with Gerard O'Connell, I'm Colleen Dulle. We'll see you next week.